Act 4. What constitutes a traitor? Despite the urgency and impending tone mentioned about the coming Colorado campaign, the establishment of the new front was delayed by around 5 months after the gun duel of '69. There were many reasons for this, and not because of failures in the preparation work done by Circle Junction. In fact, the Interfector ran his territory very efficiently to the point that much of the work was completed ahead of schedule by approximately 2 months. The largest reason for the delay was due to the size of the Legion at this time. The Legion tried its best to accommodate the growth as it happened, which is why the New Mexico campaign lasted so long. Before marching on a new tribe, Caesar wanted to be especially sure that the latest conquest was assimilated and in the ranks before proceeding. Though much of the campaign picked up towards the end, the Legion was absolutely full of new soldiers and slaves from those 300-plus New Mexico tribes that had been conquered over the entire campaign. Before proceeding, it may be necessary to quickly explain the reason for the 300 number mentioned above and in previous chapters. Many have known Caesar at the height of his legion as the conqueror of 87 tribes across the Southwest, but that number was a difficult one to calculate. For example, in previous chapters, the Guerreros del Instituto were considered a single tribe located in the old world town of Roswell. But that didn't account for the minor tribes and clans that fell under their cultural identity. As described before Montano's promotion, Montano was there when the 6th century eradicated the Gos Renegades, a raider tribe linked by history to the Guerreros del Instituto. Though the Gos Renegades were never counted towards Caesar's grand total of conquests, the Guerreros were, and many of the other subsidiary tribes were also ignored after the fall of the mother tribe. In comparison to the Old World, it could be said that the former United States conquered the Apache people of the Southwest at the end of the official war with them in 1886 after the capture of Geronimo, and despite lasting hostilities. However, the Apaches were not just one people but many, consisting of the Plains Apaches, Westerns, Jicarilla, Mescalero, Lipan, and famous Chiricahua. Other examples of these kinds of peoples could include ones like the Iroquois of the eastern continent that was made an umbrella name for the confederation of Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Mohican, and Seneca tribes. In the end, the number of peoples to fall in Caesar's expansion was far more than common perception. And this was largely due to the fact that many tribes became offshoots of a larger tribe in the vast region over time. This situation was seen all across New Mexico as well as Arizona. Caesar did not conquer individual tribes most of the time. He conquered entire peoples. It is because of this and the vast territory of both Old World states that super mutant fortresses, prepper communes, and the hundreds of roaming raider clans were also excluded from Caesar's total conquests, even though such groups also fell in territorial pacification efforts. By the end of 2269, the Legion was mostly ready to begin their Colorado campaign, but in order to officially do so, there was a lot to take care of. Outside of the preparation of supplies and equipment done by the praetor of Circle Junction, before the campaign could begin, it was necessary to mobilize the Legion's forces. After the end of the New Mexico campaign, many of the soldiers who served on that front were put on respite, like in Montano's case, and many others were put on pacification assignments. It was one thing to conquer the owner of a region, and it was another to tame it, especially in the Legion's brutal way. When a tribe was absorbed into the Legion, they essentially adopted all of the tribe's old responsibilities, having to do everything from handle hostile wildlife to clearing out raiders, to even just establishing Legion outposts or camps. So, it was during these months that much of New Mexico was being tamed and built upon in order to establish facilities to perpetuate the coming campaigns. This wasn't even to mention all the slaves from previous conquests still filing into the soldier and slave camps. It was during these months that the tribals from New Mexico were filling old and new legionary camps across the Southwest, readying to be poured out onto a new front. There would later be a name for this system of pouring troops straight into the new front, but atop all of this was more prep work to be done. With the equipment forged in Circle Junction filling the armory racks and awaiting use in Colorado, the last preparations came to the responsibility of Lord Interfector of Phoenix. This last act before the Colorado campaign officially began was hinted at previously by the man himself, an act that was especially controversial to many of Caesar's allies. Before the march on Colorado officially began, Caesar knew he'd need a staging area in Colorado proper. The ideal location for this staging area was the region of Mesa Verde. The mountainous valleys and cliffs of Mesa Verde, leading further into Colorado through the wilderness, were perfect for an advance like that. Much of the early recon done in Colorado before this point showed many potential enemies filling the region who would most certainly use the diverse terrain of Colorado to their advantage. This was something that, though accounted for, would not prevent the march on Colorado from turning into another bloody nightmare in the Legion's expansion. Located only a week's march from Circle Junction, Mesa Verde would serve as an excellent rally point for soldiers fighting in Colorado. Wasn't too far from the enormous supply depot under the Interfector's administration. The only issue with this plan of establishing a staging area in Mesa Verde was that it was already home to a tribe that allied themselves with the Legion. Mesa Verde, Caesar's ideal staging area, was home to a tribe called Twin Mothers, whose territory stretched from Mesa Verde to the borders of Old World, New Mexico. The Twin Mothers had been allied with the Legion for at least 2 years before the start of the Colorado campaign, and this was mostly out of a supply agreement. The tribe was unique because it was built on a matriarchal foundation that had women filling the roles that other societies put men in charge of. Though this was a unique practice, Caesar had his eyes on Colorado long before he knew he'd shift his focus there. And so he offered the tribe auxilia options and offered to keep watch against the tribe's enemies in exchange for supply from their lush wilderness farmlands. An added benefit of this alliance included Twin Mothers' warrior assistance in fights along Upper New Mexico. It was a strange sight to see women tribal warriors fighting alongside the Legion's ranks, but as stated before, the Twin Mothers were unique in their cultural practices, and the food and supplies produced by the tribe's male workforce back in their territory assisted tremendously in the taming of Upper New Mexico. Although it should be stated that the Twin Mothers were not a warlike people. Their female warriors were given to Caesar at his specific request alone, and so the tribe more or less used. The legions offered to remain safe from their enemies further north in Colorado. Before the Legion, the tribe was known to use the adobe ruins of ancient civilizations, dotting the Mesa Verde region, preferring to wait in their mountainside fortresses for attackers to move on rather than take the fight to them directly unless absolutely necessary. Even though the Legion treated their men and women far differently than the Twin Mothers, it should again be noted that Caesar's offer and alliance was taken out of necessity. Caesar had no intention of showing any Twin Mothers auxiliaries what happened to the women or even men of the tribes he conquered. So the importance of the alliance was focused on their supply role in supporting Legion forces across northern New Mexico. Still, the timidity of the Twin Mothers tribe was mentioned for a reason. Not long before the end of the New Mexico campaign, the Twin Mothers were assaulted by a tribe of the same region known as the Ciphers of the West. This was a tribe that roamed the lands of southern Colorado, who were obsessed with technology and interpreted their knowledge of old world science as an excuse to take what was needed from their neighbors if it wasn't given over. Though the Ciphers had been in the region for years and typically weren't a very hostile tribe, they largely stayed out of the way of Legion forces. Even though it was unusual for them to attack any territory under Legion protection, the Twin Mothers were usually viewed as an easy target for many tribes of Colorado. But their alliance with Caesar was something that prevented attacks from their other enemies at this time. So, despite the Legion banners across Twin Mothers' lands, the Ciphers attacked, ready to take what they needed from the Twin Mothers and disappear into the Colorado wilderness with hopes of avoiding Caesar's wrath. Even though the Ciphers got exactly what they wanted from their raid, they miscalculated Caesar's response to their actions. The Ciphers would largely be left alone by the Legion for years afterwards, since their attack on the Twin Mothers initiated something of an opportunity for Caesar. As they were once to do, the Twin Mothers retreated to their cliffside homes in order to wait out the Ciphers' attack before the small Legion garrison was eliminated. With history repeating, the attackers ransacked the Twin Mothers' farmlands and hunting grounds in the Mesa Verde wilderness and then moved on, leaving the tribe in their nearly impenetrable cliff homes alone. Upon emerging after the attack, the Twin Mothers' lands were destroyed, and an entire municipal garrison of Caesar's soldiers was left to be slain. Without the ability to support the Legion in that time, the tribals went about their reconstruction efforts as they'd done many times before alliance with the Legion, and Caesar was not pleased. Not only were 60% of his soldiers killed while his allies retreated to their homes, but by the end of the attack, there was nothing that they could offer the Legion. Because of these unfortunate circumstances, Caesar saw the ciphers as more respectable than his ally of tribal recluses, and left the twin mothers' pleas for retribution unread. With the end of the New Mexico campaign fast approaching, Caesar deemed the twin mothers as first to go in the event he'd ever have to betray one of the tribes that pledged loyalty to him. In the end, Caesar marked the twin mothers for destruction under the assumption that his forces could make better use of the Mesa Verde wilderness than they ever did. It should again be noted that the twin mothers were indeed an ally of the Legion, and though Caesar used their warrior assistance relatively infrequently, many other soldiers of the Legion Auxilia knew the twin mothers' name. Caesar tried his best to keep his plans for the tribe out of the ranks of his army, but word would spread just as sure as the duelists would fight again. With the Interfector put in charge of overseeing the twin mothers' annihilation, Caesar and his legate were busy mobilizing their forces across Arizona and New Mexico for the push into Colorado. Under specific instruction, Lord Interfector of Phoenix assembled a force of local sentries, with orders to exclude any auxiliaries from witnessing the betrayal of a former Legion ally. The Interfector did this by assembling 3 full sentries made of boys who'd been raised Legion from the womb, as well as 2 others. The 30th and Montano's 32nd century that had been called up from Gallup at the Interfector's request. Though it had been a long time since the Interfector led in battle, this was something he always expected to come again at some point since becoming the praetor of Circle Junction. Also, given the rather secretive nature of his assignment, he used this as a time to see firsthand what kind of soldiers he had coming out of those child camps around his territory. And so, 4 months after the start of 2270, Lord Interfector of Phoenix marched 3 centuries of his self-described Legion babies, and 2 from the veterans of New Mexico into Mesa Verde. Accompanied by his faithful right-hand Centurion Aileron, the Interfector was not sure what to make of his task. Even though he was more than ready to carry out Caesar's orders, the Interfector himself was known as a hero to soldiers of the Auxilia across Legion territory, Arizona in particular. The Interfector was well aware of his reputation, which is why Caesar put him in charge of eradicating a former ally, and why the Interfector wished he chose someone else. Early mid-2270. 3 weeks into the Pueblo siege. Centurion Aileron looked out at the distant cliffside city or Pueblo, watching several small fires become smaller in the night as the screams beyond the burnt wilderness plain continued. The twin mothers had been holding on valiantly, despite original expectations, to the point that even the Interfector was becoming restless. Those fires shrank more and more as each flaming boulder from the Legion's siege engines were rapidly extinguished by the defenders of the cliff dwellings, if not by their ineffectiveness against a city made of stone. The fog in Aileron's mind from that bitter drink had finally faded in the cool night breeze as he felt the gash on the side of his head was now closed. His attempt to lead forces against the hidden wash to the vault entrance proved to be too costly, and despite being ready to die, the Interfector called him back before too many losses were accrued. The attack wasn't a failure, but merely a miscalculation on the Interfector's part that was immediately corrected. Despite the attack happening 3 days prior, the Interfector had means of dealing with the vault itself in a more strategic way, and Aileron looked towards the east awaiting the conclusion. As the 5 centurions of the Interfector's battle group filed past Aileron into the command domicile behind him, it wasn't long after Montano entered that Aileron heard the boom. A distant cloud of dust came up from the hidden valley east of the cliff dwelling, and Aileron turned to enter the command tent amidst another surge of distant screaming. When Aileron entered, he approached the circle of chairs around the fire pit where all the other centurions were getting situated, and took his own seat before the Interfector stood up from the command table and sat in his spot. When everyone was in their places, silence ensued for several seconds as the Interfector scanned each officer. The only sound was the crackle of fire as each officer patiently waited. All of them knew that the Interfector was locked in deep contemplation, and Aileron in particular knew the Interfector was thinking less about the coming end of the twin mothers, and more about how that end was to come about. Still, plenty had happened since the last meeting like this, and Aileron recalled how the last big issue to be addressed was concluded in that explosion. The Interfector began the meeting. Diana is dead now, or gone, or whatever. It shouldn't be long before the twin mothers realized that explosion cut off any more pleas to their goddess. So, Centurion Artemis, I assume your boys are ready to tighten the noose. Centurion Artemis said, Yes, my lord. Your forces are waiting to intercept the second the twin mothers realize what happened to their vault's access and cut off their east with the advance of our siege line. The Interfector nodded silently and turned to Centurion Montano. Centurion Montano, your veterans have excellently detained the bulk of those in their counterattack from the balcony house. I need a status update on the number of captives and readiness of your unit. Centurion Montano adjusted in his chair before saying, My lord, the captives from the failed assault numbered 42 at the time of our victory. Since then, 31 of their warriors are left standing, 6 are too crippled to move yet still living at your request, and the other 5 have bled out since last evening. A total of 37 remain alive and in the pens behind the line. My veteran Centuria stands at 98 strong, including staff, no current injured, and the Century has moved up to the first line where they have stayed since the sorting and assessment of the captives. The elite nodded and paused for a moment before addressing Montano again. I would like to take direct charge of your 6th veteran Contubernia if you'd be so kind. Montano nodded. Of course, Lord Interfector. The Interfector added, Keep your 2 remaining prime Contubernia, and I would like to replace your 6 veteran units with boy legionaries of the 98th, if that's agreeable for you, Centurion Mateo. Centurion Mateo of the 98th Centuria of Child Soldiers said, Of course, Lord Interfector, and Montano said, At your demand, my primus. The elite reasoned with Montano, in the event of battle, I'd like you, Centurion Montano, to lead the advance against the Pueblo. Given your experience in southern New Mexico, I trust you the most to lead those inexperienced fanatical 16-year-olds to victory. Montano replied, It would be an honor, my lord. The meeting went on. The Interfector inquired about the 30th Century in charge of the siege equipment and learned that the unit had plenty of munitions for another week of siege. He updated the unit to focus their fire on the 2 primary gates leading up to the cliff dwelling and sent the officer out immediately to give the update. The other 2 units of young soldiers were tasked with moving up the line, and as soon as he got to that, there was the muffled sounds of distant chaos. This sound was a sign that the soldiers under Artemis were moving to intercept an excavation or investigation force heading to the buried vault entrance. The question came up about why the elite wanted to personally use Montano's veterans, but the question lingered for the moment when the former Twisted Hares explorer turned Frumentarius entered the tent saying, My lord, beg pardon for the interruption. The elite made a speak gesture and the Frumentarius went on, Lord Kaisa has taught the twin mothers a final lesson. Access to their goddess is no longer an option. The rocks have sealed the vault and... The Interfector replied, Thank you, that's all I need. Excellent work. Now send my report to Cassius at Circle Junction and be off. I need the status on that bolstering Century, so be back within 4 days. I know you can make that run. Right away, Lord Interfector, said the Twisted Hares Frumentarius before immediately departing. With the Frumentarius gone, and upon hearing confirmation about the removal of the last big obstacle, the Interfector said to all the Centurions, Retire to your previous duties, make the changes I've willed, and move the line up 200 paces when Artemis's force has completed its work. This meeting is dismissed. The group of Centurions stood up to depart from the command tent, and just as Montano was about to leave, the Interfector stopped him. Centurion Montano, stay back a moment, would you? Centurion Montano nodded and responded appropriately while Aleron eyed him calmly. The Interfector took his place on the authority side of the command table and silently motioned for both Aleron and Montano to take seats on the other side. Aleron and Montano took their seats beside one another and did not look anywhere other than the elite. The elite studied the battle plan drafts and maps across the table and tapped a pen on it idly for several seconds. The duelist remained calm and silent before the elite ceased his tapping and glanced up at both men. Moving his gaze casually from one man to the other, he finally asked both, I'm certain you both know that the twin mothers will fall very soon, but I held you back for a reason. The 2 remained silent and continued to watch the elite without making direct eye contact. Both were curious about the reason for private counsel, Montano in particular. Although Aleron knew the dilemma the elite was considering, he was curious about Montano's part in this meeting, at least if this meeting was going to be in regard to what he expected. Before any speculation could be done, the elite went on, Centurion Montano, are you aware of the issue I'm facing with the fall of the twin mothers? Montano replied, No, my Primus. Considering the recent destruction of the vault, I remain ignorant about other causes of concern. The Interfector asked both men, You two understand why the force on this short campaign has been made entirely of legionaries. Aileron had been told the reason why during several of the idle chats at his lord's side, so the question was geared more towards Montano. Centurion Montano would have said it was because the Auxilia are worthless, compared to Caesar's own soldiers, if the Interfector's face didn't say something else. Either way, the Interfector clarified for both. The betrayal of allies is something that Caesar almost never does, with the last recorded incident being the fall of Havasu in 2261. However, Caesar needs Mesa Verde as his staging area for Colorado. The only problem is that the twin mothers are technically still under Auxilia status. Even right now. The Interfector paused, and both men could clearly see that the man was disgruntled by something on his mind. He asked Montano, So, Centurion Montano, I'm sure you understand the situation I am dealing with. Montano was telepathically permitted to meet the Interfector's eyes as he considered all the Interfector said. I understand that you are in search of the best approach in dealing with the twin mothers in a way that causes the least negative ramifications to Lord Caesar's other auxiliaries. Aileron almost looked at his rival. He was so surprised that Montano understood the situation on so little. The Interfector leaned back, sighed, and said, Exactly. Although Montano had pieced together the Interfector's concern, he couldn't understand why he would hold such a concern in the first place. The Interfector's eyes glanced at Aileron, permitting him to ask his question, Has my Primus made up his mind about the dealings of such matters? The elite met Aileron with another disgruntled sigh before saying, No. Aside from awaiting the bolstering century from Circle Junction, no. He paused again before addressing both men. Caesar has tasked me with eradicating the twin mothers. No other instructions other than to leave auxiliaries out of the campaign. Though he didn't tell me this directly, he does not want word of what happened here to enter the Auxilia's ranks. So, although it will happen, I need to ensure the twin mothers end with the least amount of fallout. To put it another way, the prevention of word getting out is inevitable, and Caesar knows this. So, it is up to me to see that end happen in the most honorable way, for when word eventually does reach the Auxilia ranks. Neither Aileron or Montano could quite grasp the reason the Auxilias may take the destruction of the twin mothers as a bad thing. But Aileron was the closest to understanding that idea due to time at the Interfector's side. Montano, on the other hand, couldn't quite understand the trouble that could arise from vanquishing a simple enemy of Caesar, regardless of whether or not the tribe used to be allied. The elite glanced to Montano and permitted the man to speak, who did so in a way reminiscent of childlike ignorance. My lord, you are inferring that there is something shameful about falling to the might of Caesar? You have just said that a climactic battle is inevitable, and Montano stopped himself when he saw the elite look up. When the elite met Montano's eyes, he said, Unless a battle isn't inevitable. He paused again, studying both men before a sad smile crept across his face. I'm sure both of you are curious why I held you back for counsel. We can talk all night about the situation, but do either of you understand why I brought you here? Aileron and Montano glanced to one another and back at the elite before they said simultaneously, No, Lord Interfector. The elite smiled again and thought once more for a long moment before saying, Centurion Aileron here is my most trusted right hand. I have dealt with him for many years, and all his approaches to the many objectives of my praetorship have been executed flawlessly in cold, calculative means. Montano's face didn't change from its original state, but internally he didn't enjoy hearing such praises about his rival. That changed when the elite went on. Centurion Montano, I've read all the reports from New Mexico throughout the campaign, and I am more than impressed by what I've read about you. In your first trial of leadership, you led your forces to victory in the worst battle of the southeastern front. Your actions in the gatehouse during the fight against the guerreros was more evidence you were worthy of Graham's mask order. Now it was Aileron's turn to internally damn his rival. He tuned out the elite's praise of his rival, remembering that 44 he put in the man's chest only 5 months prior. As he was wont to do, Alaron expertly knew when to tune back in upon hearing the elite say, "I am inclined to take Centurion Alaron's advice through a display of some sort, but I wish to take your advice in dealing with this." Montano asked, "My lord?" The elite asked, "You were there on the expedition to destroy the Taotians, right?" Montano replied, "Yes, Lord Interfector. However, I do not understand what you are asking." The Interfector asked, "Was that expedition not 3/4 Auxilia?" Montano nodded to acknowledge the question and asked really quickly during a pause, "My lord, if you're asking for my input on what garners the respect of Auxilia, I would sooner ask you that question. I myself am hardly qualified to give details on such matters." The elite said plainly, "That's where you're wrong." He paused and glanced to Alaron momentarily before continuing. "My personal reputation grants me ties with the Auxilia of Arizona. As for New Mexico and even Colorado, that reputation doesn't mean a whole lot. I can slaughter all Caesar's Arizona allies personally, and any of the survivors will thank me for doing so. But I want to know how our Auxilia, which is now mostly New Mexicans, will best view the situation in the event they hear what happened to the twin mothers." Montano thought for a long time before finally saying, "If I am to be forthright with Lord Interfector, I must say that I have paid no mind to the opinions and attitudes of the Auxilia, regardless of home tribe. There is far too much variation in values amongst the Auxilia tribes, so I must also say that the universal language is the one that best gets the message across: violence. Violence is the reason auxiliaries come to our ranks, and violence is what they expect in their end. The way in which a tribe is ended is almost irrelevant to the final message." The elite stayed silent for another long moment after Montano was done. Perhaps he was overthinking the entire thing. Perhaps the matter was as simple as he thought, and his worry was only an unnecessary burden. Perhaps the ramifications for ending the twin mothers would be the same regardless of how that end was to come about. All they would see is the end result. The twin mothers were destroyed by their ally. Still, the elite had to consider the other alternative that was more tactful in approach and could offer a softer blow when it reaches the Auxilia ranks. The elite turned to Alaron and asked, "Centurion Alaron, I have considered your suggestion and ask if we have a means to carry out that display you mentioned." Alaron knew that his rival was in the dark about the other possible approach, and used his words to clarify the alternate means. "Yes, Lord. Given the captive Centurion Montano's forces obtained in the assault from Balcony House, I would say we have a sizable group for an effective means of forcing the twin mothers' surrender." Montano asked the elite, "Is this display my lord mentions also the reason he is taking control of my veterans?" The elite replied, "Yes, it is," and gave another sigh. "I simply don't know how to deal with this tribe. I assume that when word of the twin mothers' destruction finally reaches the Auxilia's ranks, the consequences won't be as dire if it is told that we allowed their surrender. This display I'm considering is the only thing that could force the surrender, and in order to initiate it, I'm having your veterans hold the blades. My only problem is that I don't want to do this with the captives if I end up having to slaughter the twin mothers anyway. There is always the chance that displays will only strengthen the resolve of defenders, and Caesar needs the twin mothers knocked out yesterday, so I'm not able to starve them out. How would it look if word gets out that we executed all the twin mothers' captives in front of their fortification and then slaughtered all of them after they refused surrender? The only message that sends is that Caesar will completely annihilate anyone who helps us." Both men remained silent for another long time. The elite put his hand to his head and shut his eyes as he collected himself and tried to organize his thoughts. The two rivals sat there silently still. Both duelists had reached the conclusion that the Interfector simply wasn't able to. There was no good way of destroying an ally. To try and force a surrender meant the possibility of an even bloodier battle, and the elite could not cater this situation to the dozens of individual Auxilia tribes. One way or another, the twin mothers' destruction was going to come about, and the ramifications weren't something that could be mitigated by the way that destruction came. After enough silence, Montano said to the elite, who still sat there with his eyes shut, "Lord Caesar is capable of putting down any problems that may arise after the dealing of this tribe." Then Alaron said, "The fall of the twin mothers, regardless of means, will be an example of legion authority and power." Another long silence ensued before the elite finally opened his eyes again and said to the two, I have made up my mind. Thank you both for your input. I see this coming situation with better clarity now. You both may leave. Aileron and Montano both stood up, gave their salutes, and departed the elite's residence. 2 days after that night, the siege was still going on. The siege engines had destroyed the gates up to the cliff dwelling 4 separate times, and the twin mothers were out of supplies to keep repairing them. The siege line was less than a mile from the gates, and earthworks were covering the burnt plain before the ancient city. Rifles continued to pop off all along the line as more boulders smashed into the stone structures. Legion raid parties continued to prod defenses around those gates, and the cries from the people in the city were heard each silent night as they continued to mourn the loss of their contact with the vault computer goddess. Still, there was no sign of surrender, despite the nightly sobbing, and the day came when the elite tried one last time to save so many through a vicious display. One more petition of surrender was offered as the 120-plus captives from the short campaign were lined up along the trenches, each one with a veteran behind them. As mentioned before, the tribe was a timid one, and their warriors were women. The twin mothers had not known war, especially the Legion way. The campaign they aided along the tamer region of northern New Mexico was unlike the southern one. The inhabitants of Mesa Verde had not known that they were even at war with the Legion until the Interfector marched his forces into the region only 2 months prior, and since then, the people were scared and helpless. The people they allied with did not appreciate their aid and saw them as a burden to be destroyed. Though the army of soldiers in crimson surrounding them was a terrifying sight, there was no way out, and their mysterious goddess was destroyed in a single night. The twin mothers had just lost their god, and the offer of surrender came to their doors, an offer from an organization they thought they could trust. Needless to say, the offer was refused out of disbelief that the Legion would keep their end of the terms. Unfortunately, the Interfector did not know what the twin mothers were thinking, what they experienced, or the reasons for their terrified refusal. So it was with a heavy heart that the Interfector gave the order. One by one, the captives were killed across the line, each one falling lifelessly into the trenches below. And the surrender was refused 4 more times as the executions continued. The twin mothers would have surrendered in a heartbeat if they hadn't been betrayed. With no reason to believe the Legion would allow any to survive, the twin mothers could only watch as their captured warriors were killed. Their apocalypse was happening right then and there. Fearing the same fate as the captives, the last offer was refused, and the Interfector's worst-case scenario was finally realized. The complete and total slaughter of the twin mothers was inevitable. When the bolstering sentry from Circle Junction arrived the next day, the Interfector ordered the march forth. Under the cover of a gray sky, the Legion marched out of their trenches towards the cliffside city, led by Montano. At the gates, Montano's vanguard was assaulted but made quick work of the broken but defiant defenders, securing the broken gates and allowing the rest of the Legion to enter the ancient city. Still with no intention of surrender, the legionaries had to put down so many of the people in their feeble attempts at defense. Before the day was done, nearly 1,000 were killed and only a few dozen were alive, most of them children. Atop a small hill, the elite looked out at the crumbling city and ordered his staff to depart from him. Aileron remained silent, congratulating his Primus on the victory but not able to fully understand his master's thoughts. The Interfector had been with the Legion for the betrayal of an ally before, and each occasion of treachery hit him in a way he tried to block out in service to Caesar. Finally, the elite could look at the distant chaos no more and ordered Aileron to relay the conclusion report to a runner. The work was finished, and Montano reveled in the glory of another fallen enemy of Caesar. The elite struggled to forget his repeating past. Aileron found himself mourning the destruction of the tribe for 1 solid second, and immediately began drawing up mental plans for the establishment of the new Colorado staging area. Just as predicted, the word still got out about what happened to the twin mothers. In the end, all 3 men were right. The Interfector was indeed overthinking the problem, and eventually saw that the means of allies' destruction didn't really matter. Aileron too was correct. The brutal means of destruction didn't serve any purpose other than displaying the Legion's terrible capabilities. Then Montano was right as well. Caesar certainly was and would be capable of dealing with any problems to arise from the destruction of an ally. When auxiliaries would later inquire about the reason the twin mothers were betrayed and destroyed, The simple answer given was that they were traitors, and the issue was left at that. Either way, most of Caesar's most supportive tribes knew that the twin mothers were one of his auxiliaries, and though there was no cascade of tribes turning on Caesar after the twin mothers fell, the seed was certainly planted. The twin mothers were completely erased, and their non-existence meant little to the news that they were traitors. All would eventually learn that the only thing that constitutes a traitor is simply what Caesar has said so. The Colorado meat grinder. Less than 3 weeks after the twin mothers were destroyed, Caesar began pouring troops into Colorado from the ruins of Mesa Verde's old inhabitants. The region was continuously built upon by legion forces as more and more troops assembled there before filing further into the Colorado wilderness. The Interfector and Aileron returned to Circle Junction to support the advance in their normal role and seeing to the establishment of a proper military fortification in the Mesa Verde region. The old homes of the twin mothers were rapidly filled with more military structures, camps, food stores, and resupply points until the bulk of Caesar and Graham's rallied forces from across Arizona and New Mexico marched into Colorado. Little change for Aileron and his primus after the twin mothers fell, but Montano remained in Mesa Verde for a short time afterward until Caesar's secret spearhead for the Colorado campaign arrived. This secret right hand of Caesar was, of course, the centurion Carnifex, a giant of a man who battled Caesar for the Hydebarks, or was a man who made legionary at age 12 and impressed Caesar throughout the New Mexico campaign. Though Caesar's mysterious commander was still relatively unknown in the ranks of his forces, those who did know of him knew he was a monster of a commander, a monster that furthered his reputation in Colorado. There is far more to the legend of Carnifex, or the man who would later be known as Legatus Lanius. But at the start of the Colorado campaign, Montano was immediately thrown into the thick of it. Even after the events at Mesa Verde, the start of the Colorado invasion was slow at first. Many more reconnaissance groups were sent out from the new staging area in Mesa Verde, but it wouldn't be long before the recon groups returned with a new enemy for Caesar to focus on. Slowly but surely, the Legion forces would enter Colorado, eradicating tribes one by one over time. Although for each square mile the Legion expanded into Colorado, the worse and more numerous the enemies became. Unlike the Arizona and New Mexico campaigns, the pace of this new front was far quicker due to the Legion size at the time, but was far worse mortality-wise. Similar to Arizona and New Mexico, the Colorado wilderness was another quagmire of violent tribes and raiders, but the Legion was not used to the terrain and tactics of the Colorado enemies. Arizona and New Mexico were populated by a similar amount of tribes, but the grand battles in open fields and desert plains characteristic of those campaigns were replaced by endless guerrilla wars in the mountains, valleys, and woodlands of Colorado. Much of the Legion's forces would be lost to attrition in the new climate, but Caesar wasn't one to be stopped by something as simple as Mother Nature. The size of his Legion was massive at this point, and with resources and manpower unlike in past campaigns, the Colorado campaign eventually gained a nickname from the soldiers who fought in it, especially the ones who served under Caesar or his pet monster in the East. This nickname for the bloodiest and most manpower-draining campaign in the Legion's history was the Colorado Meat Grinder. The name for this campaign came from what you would see if you looked at the entire front from something like an old satellite. If you could only see the Legion's advance from that high up, you'd see one long stream of Legion forces endlessly coming up from Arizona and New Mexico, filing into Circle Junction, and then through Mesa Verde, before moving up the old highways and interstates only to branch off into different places in the Colorado wilderness to meet their ends in bloody tribal battles. By the end of 2273, the display was such a common sight that seeing one endless column of legionaries marching along the old Colorado highways was something that displayed the terrifying nature of Legion power in this time. With the Legion's entire focus on this front, it should also be mentioned that this is where the next generation of Caesar's forces became the dominant one. With the first breeding camps established in the early to mid-2250s, these Legion-born soldiers eventually made up the majority of those who fought and died in Colorado. Those Legion babies, as the Interfector was known to call them, were all grown up now, and were born solely to die for Caesar on his fronts. So, this endless practice of continuously birthing soldiers early on helped mitigate the Legion's manpower needs from the conquest of places like Arizona and New Mexico. Still, though, the recently assimilated and fanatical soldiers of prior conquests were the most readily available in the start of the campaign, and those who didn't fall were rapidly filling the leadership roles of prior units all along the new front. As that endless crimson stream marched up the old Colorado highways to distant battlegrounds, the Colorado meat grinder was working in full swing, consuming the bodies of Caesar's servants, and the emperor himself had no intention of letting this up. After all, this resource-consuming process was working excellently. Despite the tremendous losses of expendable soldiers, the system was moving the Legion borders further and further. More bodies were thrown into the machine over time, and each inch of Colorado claim proved that the meat grinder could and would be clogged. Rendering the machine inoperable was proving to work, because in less than 5 years after the start of the campaign, it was almost over, and a new dynamic was shown in the array of Caesar's leaders. The timeline of this campaign is indeed a bit uncertain, with some believing that Caesar invaded Colorado after his first attempt to invade Nevada. However, many know that the Legion's biggest asset from this campaign was used extensively in the later Mojave Wars, and that asset came from the big prize of Colorado, Denver. With each day that passed in the Colorado meat grinder, recon further up the line went farther and farther as each tribe fell until Caesar had his eyes on the old world city of Denver, better known as Dogtown in the days of the Legion. By the year 2273, much of southwestern Colorado was under Legion control, but at some point, it is believed that the front was divided. Caesar himself oversaw much of the initial campaign with help from his secret right hand leading many of the victories. Although with the number of enemies in each region of Colorado, it is believed that Legate Graham was tasked with progressing along western Colorado. Meanwhile, Caesar and his true right hand were moving the bulk of the campaign north and east towards Denver. Progress was very slow under Graham in the west, but by 2274, much of it had fallen, and Caesar ordered him to begin probing Utah while Caesar himself was busy furthering the meat grinder in the east. Throughout the majority of the campaign, the Interfector and Aileron ensured the steady flow of soldiers into the meat grinder, and did so expertly. Much of the progress under Graham in the west was again said to have been slow. This meant that the majority of resources and supplies moving into Colorado were focused on supporting Caesar and Lanius in the east, with each offer of assistance to Graham being denied in 2274. The reason for these refusals are unknown, but the Interfector continued to assist Caesar on the eastern front because by that year, and despite the river of legionaries continuously flowing into the meat grinder, attrition and battlefield losses were high while reports from Graham were infrequent and minimal in detail. Even though this too is largely disputed and unclear, later stories would say that Legate Graham's progress in western Colorado and reach into Utah was slow on purpose. It is said that Legate Graham did not want to invade his homeland. Graham is said to have blamed most of this on logistics since the Interfector needed to support Caesar's demand for soldiers and supplies in the rapidly moving east. But western Colorado and Utah expeditions still weren't unfruitful to the Legion's advance. Notable battles along western Colorado were equally bloody as the ones under Caesar, but much of the differences in this divided campaign were easily chalked up to leadership styles. Legate Graham's slow advance along western Colorado could be explained by his handling of the battle at Crimson River Trail, a battle where Legion forces struck a devastating blow against a tribal enemy whose name was lost. Though the attack was a success, local wildlife continued to harass Legion forces until a withdrawal was initiated to preserve forces. It is said that the local vegetation saved the Legion forces in this withdrawal during their continued harassment by wasteland creatures until the cohort could reach the safety of their outposts at the edge of the western front. In the end, Graham was a calculating commander, and his slow progress on the west could be easily explained by his caution as opposed to his unknown rival in the east, who was gaining a reputation for excelling at throwing legionaries into the meat grinder. As stated previously, whether eastern or western Colorado, all along the Old World state, the Legion marched its soldiers further and further. However, as it was also explained, the biggest prize in the region was Denver. Denver was the biggest city in Colorado, and its standing in the days of the Legion gave it the name of Dogtown. Though the reason for the name will be elaborated later, the city was home to an enormous tribe known as the Hangdogs, who valiantly offered their assistance to the other tribes of Colorado the second they knew the Legion was marching on them. So, after 4 years and after countless lives were thrown into the Colorado meat grinder, the campaign was winding down as Graham continued his slow advance along the west, and Caesar began to consider dealing with other regional factions like a chapter of the Midwest Brotherhood of Steel. Even though Caesar was already expecting hostilities from the other regional factions, he attempted to mitigate this since he would need time after such a vicious campaign. As Caesar began taking steps to ensure a solid territorial foundation for the end of the campaign, by late 2274, there was still one enemy remaining. After 4 years, nearly 70% of Old World Colorado was under Legion control, but that last true enemy of the front was still the city of Dogtown. An enemy that was rapidly being surrounded by Caesar's personal monster, the Butcher of Eastern Colorado, the carnifex of Caesar's failed commanders, the Monster of the East. The story of our duelist picks up in this time, after over 4 years since their last meeting in Mesa Verde, and after nearly 5 years since their last fight. The story of both men continued to remain in the minds of soldiers marching up the Colorado meat grinder. Even though much of their legendary fights were forgotten in the daily conflicts of Colorado to focus on enemies in front, both men were still known by soldiers and auxiliaries across the Legion. An officer or legionary who approached either man wouldn't dream of asking them about their conflict, but so many in the Legion still knew of them. With news being almost non-existent in the lower ranks of Legion forces, stories like theirs continued to serve as examples of inspiration for service. Even in the newer generations of soldiers marching into the meat grinder, stories were very important in the Legion society. The reason stories about the Monster of the East, the Burned Man, the Interfector of Phoenix, or the feud of Aileron and Montano even circulated in the first place was because regardless of indoctrination, legionaries continued to need reminding about how to serve Caesar, even if the question "why should I serve" is never considered. Serve with merciless vigor, and maybe I'll get to serve under the Monster of the East. Don't let Caesar down, or I'll end up like the Burned Man. The nameless opposition of Caesar will ultimately bow to him when the Crimson Wave arrives and reveal new titles of unshakable loyalty. Honor and glory will be brought to Caesar's legion, and anything less will be met with steel against steel. The latter is the duality of the message in the duelist feud. Both men love the Legion, love Caesar. Both are the offenders against and the defenders of Legion glory. Who was at fault or who was right whenever they fought was irrelevant when the story was told around campfires on the Colorado front. The origin of the conflict was lost, but everyone still knew their names, and life continued for them despite their reputations. The only message received in their feud was that both men were more than willing to kill the other for their pure love of the bull. For most of the Colorado campaign, neither man really thought of the other since both were so easily lost in the day-to-day of their duties. And even incidents like their cooperation in the twin mother's destruction prove that the two could work fine together in the right circumstance. Still, though, both men played different roles in the Colorado campaign. While Aileron spent the majority of that ensuring stability across the Legion's lands in Arizona and New Mexico, or aiding the Interfector in the most brutally competent method, Montano was serving in the thick of it again. Montano was scooped up and thrown into the front nearly at the start, and spent a majority of those 4 years under Lanius or Caesar's force in the east. Montano had survived being thrown into the Colorado meat grinder so many times that he had become part of it, constantly returning to the rivers of soldiers streaming into Colorado to show them where they'd meet their ends. At the same time, Aileron and his Primus were amongst those vital men in lands of past conquests who ensured commanders like Caesar, Lanius, and Montano had sufficient bodies and supplies to toss into the machine. It is in late 2274 that the story resumes. The Interfector was recently called up to directly oversee the delivery of the Legion's heaviest equipment for the encircling of Dogtown, while Caesar was preparing for the end of the bloody campaign. There, along the crumbling old highways, where thousands upon thousands of soldiers marched to Denver and tribal holdouts, that the duelists meet again. A short window of time in the Legion's history before the enormity of its power starts to face a dramatic shift towards its ultimate destiny. Fueling the Inferno. Late 2274. Centurion Aileron stood facing the highway where another long column of legionaries marched silently along beneath a dark gray sky. Aileron tuned out the noise from the tent behind him, instead focusing on the sound of marching footsteps that echoed for miles through the scorched trees and over the hills of Colorado. The officer watched the thick line of soldiers march on by and could only identify where the next sentry began by the identifying plume of a different centurion marching close behind the passing sentry, immediately followed by his vexillarius and staff, then by the rest of his mass of covered faces. One after another, the scene did not change. Indistinct orders were barked over the sound of march, and each block of soldiers remained silent, eyes forward, and only to be replaced by another horizontal plume at the head of another formation, with orders to some different far-off battle. The sight was inspiring and stirred another wave of nationalist pride in him before his thoughts about the future were interrupted by the elite calling him over. Aileron turned back to the open-air tent where the Interfector was holding something of a feast off the highway. Aileron received the message he was sent to fetch, and the duelist had ensured that the 600-plus soldiers of the Interfector's battle group had gotten situated, and all the heavy machinery was ready for departure in the morning. It was nearing nightfall, and Aileron stepped up to the long fold-out table where the slaves had prepared a large meal for the battle group officers. Though the food wasn't extravagant, the meal across the table was made of the field rations of each officer, but instead of having the officers eat with their units, the Interfector decided he wanted to take the evening with his staff. Though small talk wasn't too common for most legionaries or even centurions, the evening could still be considered a party. By Legion standards, if anything. This is, of course, if you can consider 20 Legion officers softly talking amongst themselves at a long table to be a party. Aileron walked back over to the table and took his seat beside the elite, while some soldiers of the Prime Watch lit the torches around them to combat the darkness and Colorado cold. Aileron briefly noted that the cold in these lands was truly unlike anything he'd ever experienced, which created a necessity for the long-sleeved tunic and layers beneath his armor. The sound of the soldiers marching continued to echo in Aileron's brain before he noticed the elite looking at him, whose face was only partially visible by the soft torch flames around him. "Everything all right, Aileron?" asked the elite. Aileron immediately recalled the reason he was diverted from the table in the first place and replied, "Yes, Lord Interfector." The runner simply had a message from Caesar. The elite made a gesture for the letter, but Aileron responded, "No letter this time, Primus." The message was only verbal. "Caesar requests you to meet him up the line at the Rest Billet near Fair Play in the morning." The elite looked puzzled. "Really? That's a good 3 days up the line." Aileron corrected himself. "Sorry, Primus. I meant he said to leave in the morning. He'll expect you in the time it takes to get there." The Interfector again looked puzzled before giving a short sigh and saying, "I guess that means I'll head up on my own." Aileron nodded in agreement. "I'll leave you in charge of continuing the march while I set off at a quicker pace. I'll be taking half of my staff and leave you the rest to help keep this herd moving. Think you can handle that, Aileron?" "Course, Primus. We should be no more than a day behind you," said Aileron. The elite grinned. "You're the best, Aileron. Let me know if any of those machines break down or something. Let's hope to Mars they keep chugging along, and don't be shy to use those engineers if needed. They've been trained by the best eggheads to ever fall into Caesar's chains." "Again," Aileron said, "of course." But the Interfector interrupted again with another reminder of their bolstering cohort's objective. "Also, if any sentries along the highway need replenishment, offer them some replacements from the rear. The 71st has boys to spare, and even this far from Circle Junction, we're still in a gap-filling role. Just don't be too liberal about it." Aileron was going to assure his Primus that everything would go smoothly, but the Interfector's grin and a pat on Aileron's shoulder seemed to tell him that no reply was necessary. The killer had all the faith in the world in his right hand. After that, Aileron finished what was left on his plate before taking the runner's message and looking across the table at all the centurions chatting lively with one another. Lively by Legion standards. As Aileron took more interest in the flame-illuminated ash particles floating down to the forest floor, he felt the Interfector's hand leave his shoulder as the man turned back to the centurion on his right. "Anyway, as you were saying, Taurus," Centurion Taurus said to the elite, "I merely inquired about your family, Lord Interfector." The elite leaned back in his chair and pushed his plate to the center for the slaves to take away before saying, "Amethyst is doing all right, I think. Gabriella has done wonders teaching her how to add and subtract. Those two have been quite wonderful in handling some of the menial shit like armory inventories and shipments to the front, while I focus on more important things like those fucking Rangers. Aileron thought about the situation with those Rangers in the westernmost territory of the Interfector's jurisdiction. He was honestly somewhat agitated to hear how he and the elite were called up to personally deliver the bolstering battle group and equipment to Denver. Then he heard that the order was from Caesar himself, and instantly felt honored to join the meat grinder. Still, the presence of both men was something that couldn't impair their abilities to measure and calculate future action in their regular positions during the monotony of this march. Centurion Taurus said to the elite, "That's excellent, my lord. However, I was mostly speaking about the new member of your family." Back in Circle Junction, I couldn't help but notice Amethyst was about to burst. A prestigious elite such as yourself must be proud to expect an heir? The elite gave something of a sigh before saying rather nonchalantly, "So I knocked up a slave. Big deal." He paused before collecting himself at the personal situation he didn't much enjoy talking about. "I got a letter from Cassius the other day saying that she'd given birth sometime last week. I wish she would have pushed the kid out 3 weeks earlier or something before I got the order of march. Was gonna have the kid taken out the other way, but idiot me felt worried about what a cesarean would do to the child. I couldn't trust any slave healer for something like that, and it was too late for me to request a non-charlatan doctor from a regional township." The Interfector let his concerns hang there before Centurion Taurus said, "Still, the news is even more cause for celebration. Is it a boy or a girl?" Lord Interfector gave a small chuckle at the question before saying, "Couldn't tell you. You think that'd be one of the first things Cassius would have said after his status reports, but no. I know I have a kid now, but couldn't tell you what it is. But I'm certain it's a girl." The elite let the statement hang again before Centurion Taurus said, "I'm sorry to hear that, Lord Interfector. A boy would have grown up to be a wonderful servant of Caesar, especially with the blood of such a noble father." The elite chuckled again. "I honestly always wanted a girl, so that is what I expect." Centurion Taurus began to croak an apology for possibly offending the elite before he was waved off as the killer continued. "I sent a response to Cassius after hearing the news with orders to relay my demand for naming the child Abilene, so all's well with that situation." "Excellent choice of name for a girl," said Taurus in an attempt to rectify his prior assumption. The killer simply said, "I've always loved that name." Aileron was thinking about the Interfector's child and wondered if the elite was correct in predicting the gender. Then he got to thinking about his own servant, Gabriella, and considered whether or not he should attempt to have her spawn a child of his own. He'd had Gabriella for over a decade at this point, and though he wasn't unfamiliar with her body, he hadn't considered himself in a worthy position to produce a child. Gabriella would have been a fine vessel for his child, and though time in the Legion meant many visits to breeding camps, he still didn't feel himself to be in an adequate place to produce a child whose development he could personally oversee. At that moment, Aileron briefly considered how many of his children he'd personally sired for use in the Legion. Back in his days before placement at the Interfector's side, he'd been ordered to fulfill his pre-respite duties many times before Arizona fell. And Aileron thought for the first time ever about how many of his sons grew up in a Circle Junction soldier camp, or how many of his daughters were currently working the forges back in that slave city. Then he wondered if he had personally killed any of his children over the years without even knowing it. Aileron shrugged the thought out of his mind by assuring himself that those boys served adequately in the meat grinder or his daughters were well behaved in their duties. Aileron tuned back into the Interfector's discussion with Taurus when their conversation had reached a completely different topic. Aileron only heard when Taurus said, "I'm sure he's well. Legate Graham has led me in many battles throughout New Mexico, and I can assure my Primus that his reputation was not simply handed to him for nothing." The elite said, "I know. I just find it odd that his petitions for aid and replenishments are so few. I don't hear too much from him anymore, which is honestly a real shame since I knew the man before even coming to the Legion." Centurion Taurus returned, "If it's intel my Primus requests, I can tell you that I have a number of speculators attached to my Century that frequently relay messages between myself and the explorers out west. My orders have me assisting you in the Denver encirclement with further directives attached stating my movement to Grand Junction in the west. Because of that, I requested regular intel from out there, and can tell you that Legate Graham is currently playing defense in order to break the resolve of a number of enemies further north. I suppose you can say the legate's status in the west is seemingly a difference of tactics. The killer nodded to the Centurion's words as he was locked in thought. After a moment, the elite said, "Pretty sure I heard that too, although I can't say I know what to make of those scouting ops into Utah. Even I have received no real news about what's coming from that way." Taurus asked, "Does my Primus believe Lord Caesar will shift his focus on Utah next?" The Interfector replied, after a moment of thought, "I honestly doubt it. Lord Caesar is currently up the line and seems pretty bent on shifting further east, even after Denver falls. Last I heard, he's agreed to make contact with some chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel out here." Glancing at Alaron, the elite added, "I assume handling that situation is part of why he's calling me up the line." Taurus too thought for a moment before saying, "I suppose I'll be sitting out on any new eastern fronts then, given my placement under Legate Graham in the West Post Denver. Still, any new campaign requires a certain level of real preparation, and I believe something like that can explain Legate Graham's other current tactics." "Like what?" asked the elite. Taurus stated, "I just mean that my speculators report Legate Graham's involvement with several tribes of Utah. I get the odd intel saying that the legate is visiting a number of tribes out there to introduce them to Caesar. There honestly isn't anyone better for a job like that, especially since his reputation for what he did to the tribes of New Mexico reached far beyond Legion borders." The killer interrupted, "That's right. I believe I saw mention of him working with a tribe called Dead Horse, or some shit a couple months back in one of his ever-so-rare status reports. Ha. Still, you make a great point. Having Graham make introductions to tribes out there could certainly be useful in paving the way for later focus, something that Centurion Carnifex should have done here in Colorado, before immediately becoming a literal spearhead at the start of the campaign." Taurus added, "If Legate Graham can bring new auxiliaries into the fold out in Utah, we'll at least have tribes out there covering our borders, even if Lord Caesar ends up shifting us further east. Legate Graham and his reputation could easily win over any noteworthy tribes in Utah, since the overwhelmingly feared tend to have better chances of ensuring cooperation, if reputation speaks for the alternative." All that talk of the Legion's Legatus Imperialis got Alaron thinking about the notorious Legate Graham. As Caesar was leading the march into Colorado at the start, Legate Graham was still bringing up troops from lower Arizona. Before joining Caesar's push into Colorado, and before dividing the front between east and west, the legate himself ended up staying in Circle Junction for a few weeks. Though the man's reputation from Arizona and New Mexico was something that made slaves cower, legionaries tremble, and tribals flee, the man Alaron got to meet was not what he expected. Alaron would have described the vice-conqueror of both territories as tired, if he didn't know that legates of the Legion were incapable of experiencing that feeling of weakness. Still, Alaron thought about the man he met, and remembered feeling somewhat anxious whenever he was near him, even just following behind the elite as a formal duty in his staff role. Alaron distinctly remembered joining the elite after the welcoming formation in the interior Fortress Plaza, and how the elite offered his private chamber overlooking the plaza to the legate. Alaron recalled how the highest legate in the Legion army declined the offer to privately occupy the lavish domicile, but instead decided to share the quarters with the elite and sleep on the couch by the great window. The duelist was rarely left alone with the legate, but could recall a few moments where he offered to fetch finer accommodations for the esteemed general, only to again be declined cordially, and usually followed by a phrase like, "Thank you for the offer, Centurion Alaron." Humility was not something Alaron knew existed, especially in a man with such a terrible reputation amongst those who weren't Legion. Alaron accompanied the elite and Legate Graham numerous times on walks throughout the slave quarters, and recalled the display of numerous shift rotations. Slaves would pour out of their workstations, see the elite and the legate, and whether the people were of the slave masses or the legionary patrols, all would bow. Slaves who didn't notice or perhaps refused to bow were immediately beaten by any nearby legionaries, and Alaron noticed the legate himself lift a hand to prevent his view of the justice being done as they continued to walk. Legate Graham was a person that Alaron was simply unable to understand, much like the elite he served. There was something about the two of them that puzzled so many Legion soldiers who approached. Alaron managed to understand some of the elite's behaviors after spending so long at his side. But there were many times after Graham finally departed that made him wonder how men like the legate and elite could acquire such terrifying reputations. Neither man were the kinds of commanders that drink blood and slaughter servants, either slave or soldier, in the name of the bull, because Alaron had met and served under plenty of those commanders before ending up at the Interfector's side. So Alaron, even in this time, didn't quite know what to think of men like them who served the Legion with all their being, but seemed so outside the norm of what service like that tends to create. Men like the elite, Legate Graham, and even ones like Centurion Taurus, who entertained less duty-oriented talk, were becoming even rarer in these times. Alaron would eventually understand why that was, but didn't think about the idea much further when he tuned back into the conversation. "Some of the soldiers out here are referring to him as Lanius now," said Centurion Taurus. Apparently referring to some earlier part of the conversation, the Interfector said, "I never quite know if we're talking about the same Centurion, because I'm pretty sure this Lanius the soldiers of the meat grinder refer to is that commander from the Hyde campaign. Plus, Centurion Lanius doesn't have the same ring to it as Centurion Carnifex." Taurus said, "Every great commander has to start somewhere. It's also said Centurion Carnifex was granted elite status some time ago. If we aren't talking about two different commanders, it could be the case that Carnifex was granted a new name to accompany his raise to elite?" "Possibly," said the Interfector before adding, "Either way, Caesar called me up to Denver to deliver the heavy equipment and subsequently aid Centurion Carnifex in the siege of Dogtown. Whether Centurion Carnifex is now Elite Centurion Carnifex, now called Lanius, or if his official rank and name is Elite Centurion Lord Monster of the East, I know we'll be serving right beside the character responsible for the tremendous losses on the Eastern Front." Centurion Taurus said to the elite, "My lord, you seem rather irritated by talk of Denver's encircler." The Interfector paused in thought for a moment before giving a small sigh and saying, "I'm not irritated with the commander." "Not really irritated anyway." He paused again, and both Taurus and Alaron waited patiently for the Interfector to resume. "I just don't believe commanders like that are the best for Caesar or the Legion. I've read all the reports from Eastern Colorado since the start, and know how excellent a leader Carnifex is, but I don't believe they understand what all these losses do to the places we already own. I could show you the amount of casualties sustained since the fall of the twin mothers, and the number is astronomical, and though a number of them can be chalked up to attrition, guerrilla raids, and environment, the task of keeping up with the demand for troops in the East is something that creates an unfavorable position back in Arizona and even New Mexico." During a pause, Taurus asked, "In what way, Lord Interfector?" Alaron remained quiet, already knowing the answer from his position beside the elite. "To make up for the losses in the East, I've had to ask Caesar to relocate soldiers from the reserve pools across all territories. My Legion babies from the breeding camps help to make up for the manpower shortage of assimilation conquests, but even that can only go so far. I've essentially had to half our reserve pools, and though it's still enough to keep raiders at bay, I'm having to use auxiliaries for nearly all of the regional patrols just for territorial pacification operations." Alaron finally spoke. "The auxiliaries are currently doing an excellent job keeping watch over lands where previous reserves stood." The Interfector nodded in approval of what Alaron said before turning back to Taurus, who remained ignorant about most of the status in the Interfector's regional control. The elite went on, "That's correct. They're doing the job well enough for now, but unless the meat grinder wins to a halt soon, the Legion itself will essentially be forced into becoming a nomadic army. Sure, the amount of soldiers at our disposal is beyond the number of people I thought were even alive in the wastes, but still. Last thing we want is to have to march everywhere a conflict arises within our borders. This isn't even to mention what that would mean for our auxiliaries. The auxilia has largely been spared from service in the meat grinder, but what would happen when tribes like our allies start thinking the lack of crimson in their area means they can avoid a twin mothers type end? I'll tell you, what that means is that auxiliaries will seal their twin mothers type end by betraying us first." The elite paused for a long time. Alaron briefly looked down the table to see all the other officers still talking amongst themselves, lost in their own conversations. Turning back to the elite, Taurus too was thinking to himself. Finally, the silence on their end of the table was ended by Taurus asking, Perhaps that is Lord Caesar's reason for the costly tactic of Colorado in the first place. The Interfector glanced up, and Taurus added, "We have so many allies across Arizona and many in New Mexico that perhaps Lord Caesar believes it's about time to bring them into the fold proper. Provoking them to strike first through an absence of legionaries throughout the territory could be a unique way of authorizing their destruction." At that, the elite thought again for a long time before leaning back in his chair further and saying, even if that is his tactic, keeping up with the logistics and manpower needs in Colorado is still the reason shit like those desert rangers in the West hadn't been neutralized by now. Taurus finally asked, "So what does all this mean for your role in Denver?" The Interfector wasn't quite sure what Taurus was getting at with the question, but he still replied honestly with what he'd been thinking since the start of the costly Colorado campaign. The elite said to Taurus, "This directive to support the siege of Dogtown only means that I'll have a little more time to plan exactly how I'll handle all the problems on the home front. It also means I may have to have a short word with my new apparent peer and how to handle Denver without throwing the Legion's future away. Lanius or Carnifex or whatever seems like the kind of guy to load that future into a catapult just to break down the walls of our current enemies." 2 days later. The morning after the night described above, the Interfector set out to meet Caesar up the line and left Aileron in charge of packing up the battle group to rejoin the endless column. Within 2 hours after the elite departed, Aileron stood at the head of the enormous battle group and gave the order of march. A halt was ordered by one of the passing sentries, and one by one, each block of men and equipment stepped onto the old highway to file right behind the last sentry, further into the Colorado meat grinder. Behind Aileron was the staff members the Interfector left behind, including the elite's personal signifer that bore the emblem of the bull and sigil of the Circle Junction praetorship, with a large number, V, or 5, for the 5th municipal cohort. The praetor's 5th was technically still back in Circle Junction and being temporarily headed by the mentioned Centurion Cassius, but the Interfector's authority meant he carried it with him under orders like his current ones. So, Aileron stepped onto the old highway, followed immediately by the standard bearer and staff. Following them was the century of Centurion Taurus that served as the vanguard for the elite's bolstering cohort, and immediately behind them came the heavy equipment. 14 of the Legion's secret weapons had been moving steadily up the line since the elite was given the order to march on Denver. These secret weapons were the Legion's chariots. Though the Legion used their motorized chariots relatively infrequently, there were only a few select times in their history that they'd been utilized to great effect. One instant was during the fall of Phoenix back in 2261, and though several more had been made since then, the reason for their limited use could be explained by their tendency to break down. The vehicles lacked the mechanical reliability of pre-war vehicles like the Corvega Highwaymen, but working vehicles, especially in the Southwest, were so infrequent that sometimes the sight of them alone was enough to cause a surrender. This surrender was almost guaranteed if the functioning vehicle had a Legion banner standing above it. The chariots themselves were rather strange-looking transports that had an open engine section sitting at the front of the vehicle and was carried on 2 small tires. Although the engines on the Interfector's chariots were sheltered by vented steel plates and had trained pilots, outfitted with metal spikes attached to the front to better serve the purpose they were being brought to Denver for. Connecting the engine compartment to the rest of the vehicle were 2 sets of steel rail lines, 10 feet long and wrapped in razor wire. Sitting between the 2 connecting rail lines was a thick steel gas tube that funneled fuel into the engine from a small section beneath the rider control panel where 2 small fuel tanks sat. Another part of the reason chariots were so infrequently used was because the limited fuel section meant that the vehicle could barely go 60 miles before needing refueling. That isn't even to mention how gasoline from the pre-war days had long since become inert even if it was found in rare vehicles across the wasteland. This meant that the fuel had to be synthesized from a number of industrial chemicals and plants that weren't too common in the Southwest. However, when the crude fuel was created, usually by Legion-contracted independent chemists, and used, it caused the engines to burn it very poorly. This crude fuel created enormous black clouds around the engine compartment that easily obstructed visibility to the driver and led to even more mechanical problems with extended use. Running from the engine compartment to the control box was a series of wires mounted on the insides of each rail leading straight into the last section of the vehicle. The chariot's driver stood in the final section of these mechanical monstrosities, at the head of the gun carriage or pilot carriage, which was the back half of an old-world automobile that sat upon 2 tractor tires and had an open rear for up to 4 gunners to accompany the driver. Knowing the carriages were to be used in Dogtown, the gun carriages on the Interfector's chariots were mounted with posts that held more razor wire to shield any hounds from getting caught in the wheel wells and protect the gunners from being swarmed during their use in the siege. More details about chariot use in Denver will be further explained later. As all 14 chariots of the Interfector's battle group jerked and maneuvered back onto the highway, they kept a slow pace behind Aileron and the vanguard sentry where, thankfully, they were spared from any mechanical malfunctions that morning. Following behind the enormous black cloud those machines carried with them, the Interfector's force was bolstered by an entire slave sentry that carried supplies, equipment, arms, spare chariot parts, and provisions to support the forces already at Denver. The slaves would subsequently be attached to the forces encircling Denver, and amongst the supplies being carried on long wooden beams were the necessary tools and supplies to construct other siege engines for the efficient end of the human inhabitants of Denver. As the slaves marched behind the gunners on the last rank of chariots, the remainder of the Interfector's battle group consisted of 5 other sentries to aid and die in the siege of Dogtown. Needless to say, the force under the Interfector's banner was one that took a while each time it started moving or stopping. But the force merged smoothly onto the highway and soon became part of the Crimson River flowing into Colorado. With time being somewhat pressing, Aileron only had to stop the formation a couple of times, usually just for a short water break, or to refuel the chariots that he knew could have covered more ground if they weren't moving at marching speed. Aileron briefly considered sending the chariots up the line to have them wait at Denver, but that seemed outside his call, and if any of them broke down, the 30-man engineer Maniple would not be there to assist, which could create further delays. So Aileron marched along the highway, giving order for sentries behind them in the line to pass whenever there was a need to refuel or take care of other matters. Aileron still intended to not be more than a day behind the elite, and hoped his meeting with Lord Caesar was going to go well. It was because of this dedication to thoroughly carry out his orders that he even ordered a march through the night. So, further and further, they went up the Colorado meat grinder, and Denver was inching closer and closer. However, despite his ambition, Aileron knew that encampment was needed, and so on the second late afternoon in charge, he ordered the unit to encamp at an open stretch on the 285 that seemed to be a common sight for soldiers marching along the meat grinder to rest. Aileron saw what appeared to be 3 or 4 other sentries, and one terribly depleted one encamped along that stretch of road, and ordered the formation to set up wherever was available. So, the bulk of the Interfector's force had set up camp in an open field between 2 other sentries in the forest. There, he ordered the chariots to park in rows on the small plain opposite the primary encampment, not far from the depleted sentry that looked more like a couple contubernia than anything. By the time the force was all unpacked, night had fallen, and Aileron took his camp in the midst of the massive force. Noticing how soldiers from the other resting sentries occasionally wandered over to inspect and inquire about the foreign vehicles. Though Aileron could not hear their words directly, he could physically see each soldier group walk away from the chariot sentries marveling at the secret weapons they didn't know Caesar had at his disposal. More story than truth. Centurion Montano led his sentry through the final clearing in the woods after using a wilderness shortcut in the night. He'd been marching along the 285 for approximately 3 days before, but found the shortcut along that section of road after passing the outpost at Fairplay. Montano's experience battling all across Colorado over the years made him one of the few living possessors of knowledge about the many guerrilla paths hidden throughout Colorado's wilderness. Though he was able to pass much of the time needed to traverse the highways south of Fairplay, he needed to rest his unit and found a decent stretch of highway to put a temporary halt to his battered unit's forced march. It was the mid-afternoon, and he felt a drop of rain land on his exposed arms. He wished his sleeves had remained intact, because Montano was beginning to fondly remember the feeling of being on fire as he looked at the burn marks along his charred sleeves. Although he no longer needed to force himself into finding joy in the misery, because he'd made it to a decent enough place of rest. As he ordered his battered force through the clearing, he looked upon the distant river of crimson with relief. He'd finally found a good spot on the old 285 for sufficient rest, and even possible re-equipping if the other battered sentries at the stretch were any indication of assistance. Montano made up enough time with that little shortcut and thought about how all he would have to do is go the opposite direction of the troop columns to reach Mesa Verde. The journey was still so far, but at that spot along the highway, it was time for that much-needed rest. Montano ordered his battered sentry to camp alongside the highway on a section of the open plain, and that is exactly what happened. As his unit rested, Montano planned to use this time to figure out exactly what was needed to re-equip his unit, since the trek to Mesa Verde would need to be a rapid one. Montano's small personal tent was the first to be erected, as he continued to assist the tattered remains of his unit. There at that camp off the 285, Montano ordered the servant Raquel to await him in the tent and do what she could to prep a place for him to focus on his reports. It wasn't long before the Centurion soldiers had the little camp all set up, since his 32nd century went from 115 to exactly 33 in a space of a week and 3 days. So once he was done assisting in the camp setup, Montano felt the freezing rain stop and gave one last order to the sole survivor of his original staff before resting. He told Falco to request a supply assist from some of the other battered sentries at this rest stop. The young senior he pulled from the child ranks years ago marched off to make the request from those other units, knowing to leave the passing forces alone. Though the other sentries at the rest stop had looked like they were no strangers to the meat grinder, the other units were in far better states than Montano's unit. He knew that the other sentries would not have soldiers to spare, but supplies were something that all sentries could usually offer, especially since they'd certainly seen Montano's arrive. Montano took a little bit of pride in having such a battered unit, but he knew that those sentries at the rest stop likely had prior engagements with Caesar's opposition still hiding all over Colorado. Though the other units were worthy of praise in their own right, the state of Montano's unit said without saying that they had recently fought under the monster of the East. So, with Falco asking the other sentries for supply assistance, Montano ordered his unit to rest up while he figured out the best means of carrying out his current directive. Centurion Montano finally entered his personal tent to the warmth of a fire, and Raquel, the servant who, though a slave, looked as though she'd been in the legionary ranks of the last battle. He nodded at the woman and took his place at a small patch of dirt where his papers sat upon a cardboard box next to his sleeping roll. 30 minutes after taking his seat, and after going over his status reports and unit inventories twice, he had a solid idea of how to carry out his objective. There simply wasn't much he could do other than return to Mesa Verde like he'd been instructed to by Carnifex. He knew Carnifex had continued the march to Denver, and Montano still felt honored to be under his leadership during the brief excursion to deal with the name Erased Tribe. At the same time, that didn't prevent him from wishing the battle hadn't taken such a toll on his force, not to mention the other event that diminished his head count. Montano was more eager than ever to join the butcher in Denver, but his orders were to re-equip his unit, and Mesa Verde was the only place able to resupply and reman a sentry in the 32nd's condition. The only problem was that Mesa Verde was still a 3-week march, and there were innumerable amounts of potential delays between Mesa Verde and his current spot on the 285. Raquel was in the middle of bathing with a small bucket of water when Montano was done with his work. He watched the woman clean herself as he thought more about how unfavorable the state of his unit was. His orders were short: return to Mesa Verde, gather the troops to fill his sentry, and return. The only big issue still was the fact that Mesa Verde was a 3-week march at minimum, and he knew Carnifex was leading the 12th and 19th cohorts around Denver as he sat there. He knew 3 weeks wasn't that long, but that didn't account for the return trip that would likely be slower with a full force. Coupled with that, he'd served under the butcher enough times to know that he had a habit of destroying enormous tribes in nearly a quarter of the time it would take other commanders. The task of replenishing his century and the need to return to the monster's command was almost enough to cause anxiety. Montano then considered how he could find a bolstering century somewhere along the line, but bolstering centuries were limited, especially this far into Colorado. Because of that, Montano's options remained limited. So, with every intention of returning to Lanius's cohorts as quickly as possible, He did not know what to do about the situation, other than go to Mesa Verde with hopes of stumbling across a bannerless column of soldiers to request replenishment. Not long after Raquel had dressed herself, the veteran Decanus Falco entered Montano's tent. Begging pardon for the intrusion, Falco got what was requested and gave his greeting before tossing the Centurion a thick, long-sleeved red tunic and pair of woolly black gloves accompanied by the words, "The 59th across the highway had articles to spare for all in your century." Montano began taking off his upper armor and threw the thick-sleeved shirt on top of his half-burnt garb to keep layered as he said, "Give the 59th my gratitude." Falco replied with a fist over his heart, "Of course, my Centurion." And Montano added, "Did they have anything else to spare?" Falco replied to his primus militarily, "Beyond cold weather gear, the 59th granted your force 80 rounds of .357, 100 rounds of 10mm, 50 rounds of 14mm, 65 rounds of 12.7, 23 infantry spears, 6 10mm machine pistols, 5 14mm pistols, 6 weapon maintenance kits, 10 sacks of healing powder, 15 bottles of bitter drink, and 2 chests of rations for March," said Falco, as if going down a memorized list. Montano's eyes widened, and before Falco could go on, he asked more to himself than to Falco, so generous of them. Then met Falco's face with the question, "Did you get the Centurion's name?" Falco halted his list and replied, "Centurion Sereno of the 59th said he has no use of the supplies he spared. He explained his unit is awaiting new directive from an expected century and gave over the portion of his rations as punishment to his force." Montano spoke to himself, "That takes care of equipment and elements protection, at least for the 33. He paused again before asking his second a question whose answer he already knew. "I don't suppose he had soldiers to spare." "That is correct, my Centurion. What he allowed the 32nd is the equipment and arms from the 59th's involvement in a prior engagement. Although he did order me to inform you that his 5 armorers will have a look at any armors in need of light repairs or welding," said Falco directly. Montano thought again out loud, "The armor of my legionaries are beyond repair in a timely manner. We'll get new protection in Mesa Verde to accompany the legionary requisition." Then, meeting Falco's eyes again, he said, "Run back over to the 59th and give Centurion Sereno my gratitude and request a sum for me to owe. I will see that the aid is distributed correctly, but return to me immediately. I'll have more use of you before night falls." Falco saluted again and was dismissed. As Montano put his armor back over his new thick layer, he tossed the tattered blanket on his bedroll over to Raquel, who caught it as her master said, "Update my inventories with the supplies Decanus Falco described." Montano stood up from the bedroll, and Raquel wrapped the blanket over her shoulders as she nodded at him and took her seat at the crude cardboard desk space. Montano went to pick up some of his canteens resting near the fire pit when he turned to see Falco enter again. Falco shuffled into the tent, accompanied by the prime Decanus he put as Vexillarius. Before Montano could ask Falco how his task could have been completed in under 2 minutes, Falco said, "Centurion Montano, there may be something you should see outside." The Centurion made no word as he walked out the tent with his 2 subordinates. Upon exiting the tent, Falco gestured to the road, and following behind one of the standard sentries moving up the meat grinder was an enormous black cloud. The cloud got steadily closer until he heard a foreign noise that was so rare in his life that he couldn't quite place it. The noise was a constant echo rumbling across the plains and through the trees, getting louder as the cloud got closer. Montano stood puzzled for a minute, watching the distant formation get nearer and nearer. Montano was too far off the road to see the staff or officer leading the column, but he saw the distant figure reach the little rest area and begin gesturing to the staff members. The staff began leading the tailing sentry to the open plain across the highway, and that black cloud was closer than ever. Montano had no idea what could be carrying that kind of cloud and making that low rumble until he finally saw it. The head officer was motioning towards the small field on Montano's side of the highway. Montano made sense of the noise as each vehicle turned onto the field, and he grinned with pride at sight of those Legion chariots. The officer continued to signal the chariots, and Montano watched each one creep slowly towards the open little plain next to his small encampment. Montano counted 14 Legion chariots parked in 3 little rows, less than 200 yards from his century. The man was so transfixed on those vehicles he almost forgot existed that he wondered who was leading them. When all the chariots were parked, Montano saw the commander of the force was still too far to identify. Still seeing that distant commander, Montano saw the man standing in the middle of the road, clearly ordering the enormous force following the chariots where to encamp. Montano could hear Falco and his acting Vexillarius telepathically asking that question, so he answered it. Those are Lord Caesar's war chariots. Both responded almost at the same time. Truly impressive, Centurion Montano. Though the two were more focused on the rows of chariots and their crews dismounting, Montano was still more focused on the distant man leading that massive force. After a moment of silence, Montano told the young Falco, "Proceed with your directive and deliver my gratitude to Centurion Sereno," then altered his prior instruction. "Then find out who's leading that formation and report back to me." Montano didn't get the name of who was in charge of that formation, but instantly knew who it was the second Falco reported back. Elite Centurion Lord Interfectorem Phoenix is in charge of that force across the highway. The elite is further up the line for counsel with Caesar, but his force is en route to Denver to bolster the cohorts under Carnifex and replenish any centuries as needed. This is excellent news, my Primus. No, it isn't, said Montano upon hearing the news. Falco paused, waiting to better understand how to agree with his commander, but Montano was lost in thought. Centurion Montano thought back to the previous evening after passing the outpost at Fairplay. He thought he saw the Interfectorem Phoenix marching by himself up the road, but Montano had diverted his force off the highway only minutes earlier after seeing the landmark for that wilderness shortcut. If that figure he saw near Fairplay was in fact the Interfector, that meant there was only one other person who could be leading the Interfector's force, and that man was Centurion Aileron. It was then that Montano began thinking about the officer signaling the chariots and centuries where to go, and he could easily see Aileron as that man just by recollection of the movements he made. Finally, Montano met Falco and said, "I will be honored to requisition replenishment forces from Lord Interfector, but not his second." Falco was going to add something, but the look on Montano's face said that nothing further was authorized to be stated. The young senior of Montano's staff briefly recalled the stories he'd heard about his commander and the rival, even remembering the incident he arbitrated nearly 5 years prior. He waited patiently for Montano, but it was no use because Montano finally gave a wordless dismissal of the young man, and that was that. Montano got up to take one last look out the tent flap as Raquel set out her sleeping roll right beside her master's. The sky was dark now, and Montano looked out at the small fires and encampment around the chariots sitting in that plain. He noticed soldiers from the 59th, and the other resting sentries, including those soldiers of his own, walked to the distant vehicles. Each soldier or group at the rest stop talked with the chariot sentries before going back to their unit, quietly chatting about the inevitable doom of the hangdogs of Denver. Montano finally went back into his tent and secured the tent flap behind him, before laying down with Raquel in the dim light. Montano stayed awake a long time, more planning the best route and means of getting to Mesa Verde than anything else until he felt it was time to shut his eyes. Before Montano fell into the world of sleep, his final thoughts were about how he and Aileron managed to keep it together during the fall of the twin mothers. Both were there to do a job, and perhaps this was the same. Perhaps the rivalry was something that was more story now than actual truth. Perhaps there was no shame in requesting aid or troop replenishment from the man he fought so many times.